Can I do the first one?
Yeah.
There's a slight little technical that one of them doesn't work from here, so I'll press and there'll be a slight 1 second difference of when the slides come on. Now, those of you who were here last week, you'll about the 3 different scales into which I've divided this issue of the built environment of Russia, what its inheritance is from the Soviet Union, and what the problems are. And if you remember last week, I ended with that picture, which is the guts being taken out of a bit of the city center of Moscow, here as the capital. And we'll come back to that later and see what that's part of. But this week, what I thought I'd do is look at, here we have Moscow. Of course, the main city, it's the main showpiece of the new Russia. It's absolutely untypical of the rest of the previous Soviet Union of Russia. It's in a state of kind of turmoil, being torn apart. I even noticed that I opened the AJ in a sleepy way at breakfast this morning, and the lead letter this week, I think the Building It Illustrated, which is what caught my eye, is not actually under threat, but is about the nightmare disaster, in many cases, I think, of buildings being demolished now, which really they would be much wiser to save. We'll come to that at the end. The balance between conservation and development seems to be getting distinctly out of hand. But in 1999, in the summer, this new so-called general plan, Genplan in the old vocabulary of Moscow, was affirmed by the city council. And it looks there fairly sort of banal, as these plans do at that scale. And we'll come back to it later in the lecture. But it was is, as was said at the time, the first capitalist city plan for Moscow. Moscow never had a city plan in the pre-revolutionary period. It was tearing itself apart, rather as now, between different factions and the church and the city governors and so on and so on. So this is the first time that in the conditions of capitalism it has actually tried to look at its shape. And what I wanted to show you is actually the origins, very deep historical origins, of a lot of the issues that are now having to be addressed. We'll go back to the medieval period where some of them begin and see, for example, interestingly, it was Corbusier in the early 30s who saw exactly what these problems were going to be, and very presciently gave them some advice which they, of course, didn't follow and are now catching up on an attempt to follow in a slightly different way. So if we go back to medieval time, I cut this fairly short, this little story here, but just so you have some idea, there was a time in 10th, 11th century when there was no Moscow. It has not always been the center of Rus. These charming guys like Genghis Khan came in, this is in the 13th century, early 13th century, ran across Russia here and forced a lot of places to become defensive, but also to become tax collectors for them. And in that process, in the next, I think, you'll see there is now, by up to this sort of time, a distinctive center called Moscow of something called Rus. And it grows up here with a form that is absolutely preserved today, for reasons we'll see, a strategy in the Stalin period. A fortress, which is the Kremlin, a ring walled around it, another wall, and then finally another wall. All those walls, of course, gone, defended in this direction by defensive monasteries, which were kinds of forts around the city. It became very wealthy and started to build some of these lovely cathedrals in the Kremlin. This is the one that predates Italians coming to help them. I chose that on purpose. Around that area, in the fortress in the middle, there were a whole mass of little tiny worker settlements, passadi, which comprised essentially prefabricated log huts like this is the only one that remains, a little church in the middle, a little working enclosure, and so on. Many of them related to trade guilds, some of them to military regiments that were doing jobs in Moscow. Then after the battles in Ivan's time against various invaders, this St. Basil's was put in the middle. You see here, it's here. And a trading area here, you can just about see the little grid of sort of building. The idea is they're called rows for trading. And this represents something actually quite important after the Second World War, which is the idea of building in Russia a building to commemorate a victory. We'll see that major landmarks around Moscow, 7 of them were put up by Stalin exactly in that period, in that spirit after the Second World War. Now, this is by now just pre the founding of Petersburg. This is in fact the family of Peter the Great, Narishkin family, very rich. A flowering of things in Moscow. It was a very prosperous place by this stage, but it was very much looking backwards to old Russia. And Peter the Great, of course, trying to modernize the country, full of ideas from Holland, from England, from his travels in Europe, founded St. Petersburg as a new capital. And so Moscow has actually spent 200 years, from I think it was 1712, if I'm not mistaken, Petersburg actually became the capital, till 1918, not as the capital of the country. Through a period which, as we'll see, is very active in terms of trading, in terms of industry, but left it with a strange imbalance in terms of buildings. No government buildings were in Petersburg. And very close to the center, as we'll see, industrial activity. Now this is, you can see it's 1800, this is largely textiles, also metallurgical industries, metalworking industries. On that side, essentially downwind, where the watercourses are. And this sort of location is terribly important because this still, well not now, but in recent years, the end of the Soviet period, was the main area very close to the center of by then clapped out factories, and is one of the zones which is now seen as strategic for restructuring the city, for, as they say, a role as a global city. This is, as you see, trading places, mostly open markets, and again, very close to the center, scattered, but very close to the center. Retail trade, wholesale trade was very much associated with the core of the city. Again, another problem that goes right on until the late Soviet period. 1851 came in the first railway, which actually you see the station there, and within a few years, certainly about 100 years, a whole series of railway lines coming in here. You can just, this is a map 1902, you can see them there. Already producing another problem, which is through their radial division of the city, a great problem about its moving circumferentially. It's become, we'll see this when it comes to, for example, 1971 general plan, one of the main Soviet plans, key one after the war, consolidates this radial structure and produces great difficulty, of course, in connectivities across between zones here. So this problem goes back right to that development of the railway. Now here in these little passadi, these areas now of working people quite close to the center, this is a typical one. You have this is on the Moscow-Kazan railway. Maybe a couple of factories, one common water point, very primitive. This you see is start of the 20th century. An open market for the district and little rows of housing like this, a house, a space, each on your own plot. Very rural, little workshops around and so on. Moscow was called the Great Village right through the 30s, Bolshaya Derievnya, and it was largely because of this very open structure. Even the old city had this sort of form because it wasn't till Peter insisted in Petersburg that you built to the street that really Russia had European corridor streets in any sense at all. Now this area around here, the next sort of ring around the central core, in the turn of the last century, it became massively developed. This is typical, very undecorated, some of them are dripping with Art Nouveau, but of the scale of middle-class apartment housing. Dochodnie doma, profit houses, literally. Very handsome apartments, now extremely sought after. We'll see that kind of thing next week. But producing very high density and a very solid, good quality fabric around that part of the city. The beginning of a middle class that never, of course, in Russia really got to be very developed. Nightmare traffic problems. That's Tverskaya going up here. It's not as dense as it might be. That's, I think, about 1900. And a whole series of projects for metros. Several of them actually not underground, but above ground on stockades, like the loop in New York. This is where you saw the incapacity of old Moscow to get its act together. Everybody fought against everybody else for the rights, and the church didn't like these things going past the churches and so on. So on the eve of the First World War, the place is bursting with a kind of energy that is perhaps mirrored again today. These are two images from a series of postcards put out, very famous postcard, by one of the confectionery companies, which are Moscow in the future, 1913, just before the First World War. And here you see two extreme views, which in a way are again mirrored again today. One here, this is Red Square, the history building, absolutely gone crazy on a kind of, you could say, Stalinist steroids, as it were. Typical futurist delight in all this machinery and uncontrollable movement and so on. The other one is actually more subtle. The other one, according to the legend, is about ecology. It seems to me as a rather charming combination. All these people are out at the Petrovsky Park in the north, dressed, you see, in historical costume. There's a kind of postmodern idea here about references back to earlier idyllic ages, but they're breathing absolutely clean air. And the whole of this is absolutely pure air, reflecting, of course, the state of Moscow's pollution, which is again a nightmare again today. Now, revolution, we saw these two last week, looking at the larger scale things, very important. 1917, socialist government and the nationalization of the land and all real estate. Liberating architects, planners, everybody to think of the city, to think of the whole country as one space. And of course all socialist planning subtended from that act. Again, yeah, I showed you these two in a different context. Moscow became the capital, 1918. As I've already said, the government came back here to a city which had no government buildings in it. And they took over hotels, they sort of camped in the Kremlin. It was really only in the 30s that anything for ministries, and again after the war, started to be properly built as purpose-made buildings, trying to reorganize the life of ordinary people, to educate them, to give them some kind of health care, looking after children and so on. And the first attempts at planning Moscow, two here famous ones, this is Zhaltovsky, famous academic architect, this is Shulsev, 1919, 1922. Really, this is quite fun because these are all garden cities here. This is unloading the city into cottage settlements. This is Shulsev really just tweaking with the central spaces to try and give them some paradness, some sense of celebration of a new non-capitalist culture. And by the middle 20s, here this is from a rather interesting book about, it's a report of a study group that came from Moscow City Soviet to look at big cities abroad. Came to London and was very engaged by things like underground, how not to do it. And went to Birmingham. There was some amazing sewage works in Birmingham. This is quite entertaining. But here, London, of course, was, you see, a place to look at. This is the largest cities of the world by population. Moscow, Tokyo, Chicago, Berlin, Paris, New York, London. Very conscious that something was going to hit them now that their population is zipping up like that. Industry coming back to the city, that revival that we saw last week, back to pre-First World War production levels and so on. And these two, here is the Garden City solution. This is the kind of thing that the city was building. Very worthy workers' housing stuff, but not according to any larger plan for the city. This represents, these are actually mainly modern movement monuments, but it represents workers' clubs and the constructors building so. I put on, it represents the spottiness, the lack of any coherent idea about growth that characterizes the 20s. And here I think I showed you also this. This is cities expanded or new cities in the first 2 5-year plans, from 1928 through to the early 30s. And this just, I put it on to remind us, this is Moscow, which is going to have massive investment. But investment that will not relocate industry, investment that puts it right back in those sites that we saw developed in the 18th, early 19th century. Now, we come to 1930s. A city which has got no real coherent plan, which is, however, very conscious of its role as the center of potentially a world movement of communism, certainly as the center of the USSR. And we see now two things which shape the whole future of the city: a competition for a building, and then a general plan, the first serious plan, 1935, which is really what shaped the city we see today. Now, this cathedral was built, I may have shown it to you last week, in honor of the victory, in this case the victory over Napoleon. If you've been to Moscow lately and wonder why it's interesting, what you see now is, of course, a replica. We'll see it being rebuilt. 1931 was knocked down. There you see the pile of rubble, in order to put there something which would be a great parliament, a palace of the Soviets, of the councils, literally, for the new Soviet state. And the whole, this is a story in its own right, but a competition which projects like this, modernist sort of buildings, came in, and a committee which in the usual way doesn't know what it wants till it sees what it doesn't want. This is from October 1931, at the end of the first round. And here, this is statements by the committee for the jury of the competition. This new building, whatever it's going to be, which is enormous, it's got one auditorium, 15,000, another 8,000, and goodness knows what else accommodation. It must, of course, correspond to its purpose. But as they explain, purpose has two dimensions. The form of the building, they say, must be determined by its internal contents, by the working functions of the accommodation. While this principle is correct and adequate for any utilitarian building, however, it is correct but not sufficient in relation to the Palace of the Soviets. Since this must be a monumental structure, distinguishing itself as an artistic and architectural monument of the USSR's capital city, and characterizing the epoch and embodying the desire of workers for the construction of socialism. This is a paragraph, one of these somewhere in here, I forget exactly which. In this case, they say, the functional method of design must be supplemented by a corrective, the aesthetic treatment of the form. In this, all forms of spatial arts must be deployed. Architecture, which gives proportionality to the parts, painting, which deals with color, sculpture for its handling of light and shade, all in combination with the technologies of lighting, with the art of the theatrical producer, and so on. And there were then some more schemes. This is a very modernist thing by a pupil of Leonidov's. This is a thing by the Zhaltovsky. This, of course, is absolutely not what anybody wants. This is criticized because it is bitty. It can't express unity if it doesn't have a clear center, and so on. architecture, as we've seen in their phrase, must be an active art, nothing unadorned. We must have, in the next statement they made, sculpture and the other arts. Very crucially here, these relate. It must use the best of both modern and traditional architecture, conforming on the one hand to the highest technical achievements of today, to create a distinctive work of the socialist age. On the other hand, arrived at by the means of critical assimilation of the architectural heritage, which meant, as they said, learning critically from the past, using those things which were still relevant, formal things, organizational patterns, and so on. As Vestia said, assimilation does not mean copying. It is a creative activity of upward march from the peaks of former culture towards new achievements. It's some kind of new synthesis between the technology, the social aspirations of the new, and whatever is deemed to be the culture of those people, which is not this, which was deemed to be Renaissance and irrelevant. And this may be using compositional spatial motifs in an ideal solution of the old in some new way. So this was, in shorthand, this was the most desirable solution in the end. You see it there. It was compared to all the other buildings of the world and deemed to be not yet the biggest in volume or the highest. So it became bigger and higher. And the foundations were dug but aborted for a series of essentially totally practical reasons. It was all madness. When I first went to Moscow, and for many years, this was an open-air swimming pool. Some of you may have seen it. You could bathe in the steam in the very center of the city. It's quite extraordinary. So that was the fate of that story, and as we'll see, the message of that about the socialist realist theory of how you use history and so on, now it applies to the planning of the city. About 1929-30, there was that massive debate that I mentioned last week. It'll pop up in a second. Out of it came also attention to Moscow, and this is one of the modernists, Ladovsky, saying it's got to be about growth, it's got to, see the Kremlin is down here, grow out in a great parabola, constantly expanding. This is Meyer, who'd come, of course, from the Bauhaus, trying to rationalize this thing in some kind of slightly Germanic way. Just I show you two examples out of many. And the interesting observations were Corbusier's. He was in Moscow. I'll show you, or here we have his Centre Soyuz building that he won in competition in the late 20s. And he was several times there discussing this. In the end, he never saw it finished because Stalin's clampdown cut him off from it. But he was then invited by the city to make some proposals about its future. Now, I just recap here to last week. You may remember this, the constructivist argument about how the city, or towns as nodes, should be allowed to disperse into these networks of settlements where there were no nodes, in theory. And asking the question as to whether that isn't the logical outcome of new technologies, electricity, transportation, and so on. The revolution in transport, the automobilization of the territory, reverses the usual argument about the inevitability of congestion and the crowding together of buildings. This was Okitovich, you may remember, of the constructivist group. The party said, it's absolute nonsense if this is maybe all right for the future, but for now, it's vital to concentrate the proletariat in a confined space, to rally the forces. The conditions are not yet ripe with us for any kind of other human settlement, organization. We're leading people from one stage of development to the next. Only in that way can a new life be built. Anything else is infantile leftism, has nothing to do with Bolshevism. Now that has a resonance again to today when we come to this notion of a global city and the idea of concentration, of intensification of activity, now of course knowledge-based industries, this kind of thing, being key to producing a critical mass that puts a city into that very special category. Corb had seen all this, and if you remember, I said he actually agreed, but for quite different reasons, ideologically, with the Soviet decision. Industrial intellectual products alike develop only when human masses are grouped together, said Corb, living as a collective, in a rather capitalist sort of sense. They are the fruit of concentration. Dispersion deprives the mind of what it needs for development and weakens the bonds of material and intellectual discipline. Dispersion is for rest days only. Seulement pour le weekend, those little huts, he said. So he was given a questionnaire, as I say, by Mossoviet. He was expressing interest. And his answers to it were published. You'll see in a minute the book that they were published in Russia. I just put this on. This is the city in 27, when this famous Izvestia building had just been built in the center. So it's just about the date of Korb's first visit. And it explains, I think, his overriding message to the people of the city, which was that Moscow is, he said, une ville provisoire. It's a place that hasn't yet, it's provisional, it hasn't temporary, it hasn't yet got formed. So don't invest in it anymore, restructure it, by the way, according to my plan, now, because you'll be hit otherwise by terrible problems. We'll look in a minute at what are, in a second, at his proposals. But you can see from a picture like that that this is not like the center of Paris or London yet, partly because, as I say, it had not been the capital for 200 years, is not yet a city with, in most areas, except these apartment building areas, solid fabric. It's a lot of these sort of little buildings are still there even when I was first there. This went in the 35 plan. So it is une ville provisoire. It's a city which you ought to be knocking down and starting over again with. Now this, his Ma réponse à Moscow, you can read it, of course, in Western sources. In 34, they published his urbanism, and it's in the back of there. You see part of it here in Russian. And here I've enlarged and colored up the two key drawings. Now, what did he say? He said, you had the great advantage, having eliminated land values, differential land values, by this nationalization. You have a chance, which he said does not exist, for example, in Paris, to demolish everything and remake it. The central fortress, he said, this is a serious obstacle to providing the rational and life-giving transport and communications needed by a large city, precisely because everything was coming in the way we've seen to the center. If they were, he said, entertaining serious fantasies about the growth of automobilism, they must recognize that only a rectangular grid could, as he said, provide proper links between the whole range of different parts. And now was their chance to lay that out by doing it in a thoroughly Corbusian way. He said it was entirely inappropriate that administrative and government functions are mixed up with industrial zones. And you can see from what I've said about the history how this had happened, that industry is all around here, very close to the center, retail trade, wholesale trade, all in this fighting for the same territory. He said you must get a central railway station rather than all this multiple lines dividing up the city that we've already seen, so that the whole thing can flow from that distribution point. And there was a lot of detail about the parking. There's some housing Arredon in here. Maybe I put on here his, yes. This I showed you last week. This is 2930, the first Soviet cars coming out of a Soviet assembly plant. And here, this is the kind of housing, I haven't got it on the slide, that he proposes for Moscow, showing where all the garages are. And the state of central Moscow now in relation to private motor cars is such you realize that would have actually been a very good solution, having not provided for motor cars through the whole Soviet period. Now, we have, so Moscow, this is not, of course, the Soviets are not about to knock down the city, and they're certainly not about to restructure it on capitalist lines a la Corbusier. But you may remember this man from last week. He published this book in 1912, having been in London in 1910. He was at the International Planning Conference in London, met Unwin, knew what was going on in the West. He was rather radical, his wife was, and he'd been here in emigration. Published this book, 1912, the planning, almost literally, the public servicing of towns, when he got back to Russia. And said in his introduction, I think I perhaps paraphrased this to you last week, I might read it now. For all our backwardness, we cannot copy any one of the foreign ready-made models. Too precious is the inheritance that we have in the past centuries of Russian history, a heritage that is still little known, unresearched, but hides in itself also new forms and ideas. We must send our young architects out to study the ancient Russian towns. There, in grey antiquity, to find the foundations of the natural Russian town, to radically rework it, bringing to it all the achievements of contemporary knowledge and science, eliminating in the embryo the shortcomings from which old European cities suffer. Too different are we in natural conditions and in our character to repeat European examples without modification. Well, this man now, as we should see here, this is in 1937, is now the head of the Office for a Moscow Plan under Stalin. So any time he starts it in 1931, 1932, 20 years, a revolution and a war later, since he wrote that. And as perhaps you can already hear in the quote, absolutely corresponds deep down to the attitude now of the party to the heritage that they've inherited. So a plan is now drawn up, which they're working on, of course, for several years, 31 to 35, which absolutely preserves this old radial concentric structure. The very thing Corbusier and others had said is the downfall of the city. For why? Because as we saw with the competition for the building, the functionality in practical terms is only half what interests them now. In fact, it's less than half. What interests them is the psychological symbolic dimension. And this was said to be now a perfect representation of the very heart, nothing could be more expressing centrality, of the Soviet state and its, as they still hoped, role as the center of a world communist society. So these roads coming together, the core, the Kremlin, absolutely embodies. It's something in, as they say, the natural Russian town, which here still has validity for the new ideology and is therefore in this critical assimilation process to be preserved, accentuated, not destroyed, but scaled up, adapted to a modern technology, to modern requirements. Now this is from the, I don't know what that is, sorry. This sort of quote at the beginning of the official book of the Moscow Plan of 1935, which Semyonov was the chief architect and planner. And this is Kaganovich, who's then the head of the Moscow Party and the head of the whole thing, saying, in replanning Moscow as a socialist city, we shall not permit the extreme concentration of large masses of people or activities onto small sites. They took they almost doubled the area of Moscow in order to reduce the density. The structure of it was fine, they said, but it was grossly overcrowded. This is late 20s typical Moscow street market. So density overcrowding is capitalist. The drive of this plan, as we'll see, is to preserve the structure but reduce the overcrowding. And here, this is from another part of that book. Here you have Stalin and Kaganovich looking over a diagram of the plan, and you see it absolutely preserves this radial concentric structure. This is the main sort of controlling drawing of the plan. You can see it's absolutely preserving the structure, and here you see that's a more detailed one. What it's doing, this is the main street that goes up, it must be here, is knocking down buildings, as we'll see, moving back buildings, enormously scaling up the structure that they'd inherited. Here you see this, we saw this street earlier, and notice those two towers here, Savinsky Podvorye, it's a kind of hotel. Here you see them at the back there. That building is a major building, very strong, robust, lovely structure, moved back. Another building is put in front of it. This is just before the war, this photo here. All that area has been cleared and the new buildings are going up here. So that this street becomes this great thoroughfare leading north. And other streets were treated in similar ways. More would have been done if they hadn't hit the war. Another key dimension of it is that these intersections everywhere. First of all, I should say that this lining of the main streets as a kind of almost theatrical frontage to get this solid fabric, which is what it didn't have before, which is why Cooke said it is provisoire, it has no firm structure to it, it's fixed. To get that framework in place, but also to create at the intersections here real meaningful places, ensembles, as the Russians call it. A gateway here, I think this is down here, on Nevsky Prospekt. Down here somewhere. So that there is a sense of the meaning of community, of district, that the thing has, in a monumental sense, some kind of structure to it. At intersections, there would be buildings like that. That's by Golosov, who did Workers' Club in the 20s, rather famous. Some very inventive things in this early 30s period. Then one of the great arteries ends in this great industrial plant as a kind of celebration of its outer end down at the south. Here you see, that's a funny thing. That was Gorky Street there. This one that was widened came down to the Kremlin. And here we're looking, that's the Palace of Soviets there, which they still think they're building, of course. And here we're looking at it from down this way. Magnificent, great avenue, totally different scale from the historic city, focusing on it with the Kremlin behind. Other things were cleared away. This lovely tower was knocked down, erected by Peter. All these markets were pushed off places like that. Here between, this is Red Square, between the History Museum and here, there's a lovely gateway, which we'll see has been restored now, swept away so that the great parades could come into Red Square for the Revolutionary Anniversary and May Day and so on. Massive swathes of the city cut out in order to put this new structure, this new scale onto it. This is from a book designed by Rodchenko and Stepanova in the middle 30s. You can see here, this is like an advent calendar. You can see the circle there. You open it up, and underneath there's now a metro. It's rather jolly. And the head of this was Nikita Khrushchev, who will shortly, in some years, of course, after the war, become the head of state. Great engineering, terrible loss of life, but an extraordinary investment in the fabric of the city. Here you see first lines, the black ones, opened in May 35. That's actually from a slightly later stage, but another kind of armature put into the city. It's a kind of aesthetic story in its own right, doesn't concern us here. Now, as another major aspect of this plan, it was all about modernizing the city, which was very prone to floods. This is the famous flood of 1908. And massive embankments, all that strong edge to the river, which you see now leading up to the Moscow-Volga Canal and things, up to the north, also Bielamur Canal, was put in as part. And private, this was to be a city good for living in, as the present plan claims it will be for the 21st century. This is another of these darling little fold-outs. That's the little flat in there. And this is about district heating. How much gas, how much... This finally put a kind of 20th century utilities into this essentially semi-medieval city, as it still was. And this is the sort of building that went on. That's that kind of housing, more monumental stuff in the center. Very serious attention, this is in the Metro, Mosaic, this is another housing on Gorky Street, to the arts. In this case, it's a building for people who work in the agriculture ministry, There's a special studio, did this kind of artwork by making classical architecture that expressed something about the function and the clients for the building. We had the war, which we saw last week, I think these two slides. German invasion, this is Germans. Building continued in Moscow through the war. There was a whole metro line opened in the war. And this is from the Stramiento of the guide handbook for city planning at that time and after the war. You see the kind of scale of the streets. This is extremely solid building. But this, in this case, does not have the rather charming trees of the tram going down the middle. This is, I think it has a tram in that picture still, Kutuzovsky Prospect, but you see the scale, extraordinary scale. Now, all that continued after the war, and there was a very, actually, I find it first about 1940, serious concern amongst the planners that the city, because it was growing up like this, was losing what I mentioned last week was terribly important for a Russian town traditionally, its profile, its distinctive silhouette in the landscape. And this is a series of silhouettes of Moscow where here, as they say, it's losing this distinctive form. They still think vainly after the war they might have a palace of the Soviets. But here we see now other buildings put, these high buildings as they're called. You can picture it, I put this on, this lot grows up above the churches. Of course, they'd knocked down a lot of the churches in the 30s. And you've got to assert something else again above them to produce some kind of distinctive landmarks and shape within the flat landscape. And here you see one of these so-called high buildings, Vysotnye zdania, going up actually under construction and the level of the city that's rising around it. And here I put this on just to sort of make the point of how they saw these, which is something Americans, of course, love to say, but we did that in Chicago in, I don't know, 1890 or something. These were seen as having quite a different role. These are not an individual company asserting its ego and its commercial power. These are very distinctly not American skyscrapers. They say they are statements of identity, victory statements also, giving Moscow back a kind of shape after the war. Now here we see there were 7 of them in the end built around the city. This is Moscow University here. And here this rather bad Soviet slide is looking out from the Kremlin towards this one, on axes out from the towers of the Kremlin, but at quite a new scale. Placed, I just briefly go there, sometimes this is very typical location of a monastery above a river bend in the traditional Russian town building, and here this one just below the Kremlin, again on the bend. They very much have its, if you see them in a Russian historical context, a very organic connection, I think very genuinely to their approach to urban form. Now this here you see a poster, this were to Stalin, his statement, victory statement. And they were very fine bits of construction, very extravagant, very large apartments in them and so on, some of which we'll see next week what's being done with these things now. But I think we had this last week, Nikita Khrushchev, here he is in the UN, but making a speech in December 54 in which he said we can't afford that, this is not housing the people, it's a grotesque waste of people's money. And we should go over to a prefabrication and quite different space standards. And now critically for us, this is the 35 plan again, this sort of building. Leapt over, as the current planners talk about it, this whole industrial area and started to grow in outer areas around here. So there wasn't an organic growth outwards, industry had been consolidated on this quite central territory, and this stuff was outside, cut off from the center by the industrial zone. In the, this is late 50s, coming into the 60s sort of stuff, a lot of this is panel construction, a lot of it quite nice, very Russian courtyard, and the idea beginning even that time of a micro district, of a thing which has a self-sufficiency with primary schools, there's a rather low level of shopping provision and so on, but has its own food stores, and where people can live a lot of their life without crossing a major road. In the late 60s, there was a major insertion in the old fabric. This is very essential. The Kremlin is just down the road here. Kalinin Prospekt, as it was called, there's one of the towers. Brutal bit of surgery through the city centre. Buildings at the back here were literally cut off. Nice Art Nouveau buildings. But it did create a kind of downtown atmosphere, a kind of place to go, something with that kind of sparkle to it. Now, the 1971 plan, I haven't got it, I realized late last night on a slide. I use this to represent it. I mentioned already, it was a plan, I have just the journal here from 71, which consolidated this by stressing the green zones coming into the center, consolidated the separateness of the radial routes, and actually has produced, although often it produced rather, in their way, nice green, nice enclaves within greenery, actually now are a major structural problem. And in the documents of the 1999 plan, they refer back to the 71 plan as the source of yet more of their problems. This is a sort of edge condition. I say sort of in the sense that you don't really know whether it's a condition or just an accident. High-rise buildings, this I took in sometime in the early 80s, I think, on the more or less the edge of the city, not the absolute edge of the ring road, but nearly. And just a little interlude here, look at one or two schemes which were done by young people in the School of Architecture in Moscow and Marhi, led by very good teachers, in this case Andrei Nekrasov, using, they did this more in the late 80s, but even at the beginning, using competitions and opportunities abroad. This was a UNESCO sort of studio competition thing for young architecture students, 1980, to critique the situation at home. And this is, they call it a city, but it is Moscow, when they talk about it in detail. All the things that have gone wrong in terms of the isolation of communities out here, the lack of any social provision for these people. Very often, of course, shopping was proposed but never got built. All sorts of things didn't follow on as they should have done into these housing areas. This is a bit of shopping in the bottom of these buildings here. And the very deep malaise for the large amount of the population that lived out there, that it was still only the center that provided decent shopping of any Soviet kind, theatre, cinema, and this kind of thing. This is part of it. You can't read the writing here, but this is all about developing, there's one of these blocks, you see, using an outer railway that runs around here to build. At the weekend, all these panels would be delivered here, and all kinds of life would develop along this route, and it would become a place which had its own vigor as a peripheral zone of the city. Nothing happened, of course. And here this is actually one of these people, Laktyev, who we saw as a so-called Soviet archigram in the 60s last week. This is called a cosmic city. And I put it on as some idea about this place having existence in a larger world, which it floats free in, which is perhaps how they're beginning to try and see it today. This is by young architects, students. This is about rehistoricizing the city. You see, it's a kind of fantasy. It's about 1982, if I recall, of the existing city. Certain buildings go on, and then finally they get rid of them, and the whole historic thing is built back as a piece of history. So it's not that people were unaware, it's that just that nobody officially could do anything about it or was responsive to this kind of crisis. We have, of course, Gorbachev, his revolution for the world and all that, followed by Yeltsin. And for Yeltsin, as now for Putin, this man, Yuri Lushkov, is the mayor of Moscow and the driver behind the present situation. When he came, well, in fact, when he'd been in power for quite a while, he published a book, which you see here, We Are Your Children, Moscow, with a suitably romantic title, which I'll just read you its little dedicatory beginning. This is Chernikhov. Looking at drawings, engravings, and photographs of old Moscow, one is tortured by the question, why has this beauty not come down to us? I first saw Moscow from a helicopter 10 years ago, when I had just become part of the city's executive. How beautiful, I said to myself, and yet how appalling. The city from above gave the impression of something seriously ill. Roofs were rusty, neglected, smothered in rubbish, and quite revolting. But the worst thing was how everything had been thrown around by the Bolshevik willfulness, ripping old buildings out of the city fabric, stacking up crude boxes alien to the spirit, and leaving a wasteland where once the places had been cozy, that's the Russian Uyutna, it's a bit like Heimlich or whatever in German, and good to live in. Beautiful and yet dreadful. Moscow from above created an impression of something that had unraveled, of a body that had grown putrid with ulcers and holes, of a city which needed long and painful medical treatment. And he sees himself as giving it that medical treatment. Now, there were a number of things that were done in the beginning, which I have to say surprised everybody, I think, by their success and effectiveness. I showed you that picture where this gateway had been swept away to get into Red Square. And it is put back here, very archaeologically exactly. And I have to say, I saw it first very skeptically some years ago, but it does indeed frame the entrance to Red Square with an extraordinary human scale and shock into this great space. Architecturally, spatially in the city, very successful, I think. Then, of course, that cathedral that we saw demolished in 1931 by Stalin was rebuilt. This is somewhere here, that's Chernikhov, I think, as the mayor, when part of this jolly good solid concrete frame was being dedicated at one stage. A lot of these sort of chaps around now. There you see it back. It's not a very good picture. I took it one evening from a hotel I was staying in by Red Square, but you see it back in the center of the city. And I'll read you something that says Dmitry Shvedkovsky, who's a very good critic and a senior member of the Academy of Architects. It's been here. Indeed, this was in AA Files. He published an article when he was here. This is in 97. By the middle of 96, the gilded profiles of the new cupola and the four little ones were sparkling all over Moscow. Before that, many architects and critics had spoken out against copying this structure, on the grounds that it had no particular aesthetic merit. However, when the cupolas began to appear above the city, the success of the enterprise in terms of urban design became immediately obvious. The result was unexpected. Restoration of this landmark of central Moscow had effected a mobilization of many elements of the spatial and formal order of the 19th century city, which suddenly sprang to life, streets which had been oriented towards the cathedral, the public spaces over which it had towered, and riverside views for which it had served as the focal point. Overall, the strength of the central historic core was enhanced in relation to the uncoordinated periphery. Now, we come to that picture I had of an excavation site at the beginning of the lecture, which was here. It was viewed from here onto that space, which now contains a multi-level, absurdly glamorous shopping center. And something which seemed at the time very strange to put that there. I think, again, Shvedkovsky rather sagely understood its significance. This is him again, the same paper. Soviet society had become accustomed, under 8 decades of the old regime, to universal and all-pervading ideologization. It is thus inevitable that in this post-Soviet era, and this is already a few years back, you realize from now, a system of symbols and slogans should emerge to replace the previous ones. It is perhaps most of all in the replanning of central Moscow that the ideology which has not yet been verbalized by politicians is most revealing and openly manifest. The part of Moscow space that is most sensitive in its ideological meaning is that semicircle of squares and areas which embraces the Kremlin. That's to say, this area around here. For Russians, this area is not only historical, it is sacred. It represents not just their past, but also, in their terms, the spirit of the common people. This direct identification, which had already emerged in the Middle Ages, was especially fostered in the 19th century. Thus, it was here that a very specific conception of architecture parlante arose. In proximity to the Kremlin, architecture speaks, and has done so over the course of 4 centuries. This is a reference to some of these buildings that were erected in various historicist styles of that time, 19th century. Thus, the merging of the new and ancient Moscows under Yuri Lushkov, the popular and active mayor at that time, still active, not so popular in some circles, commerce is itself part of the ideology. With this underground shopping centre alongside the Kremlin walls, he says, we are already venturing into the territory of ideology rather than profits. That's to say that it was about saying you yourselves, your own indulgence, you as individuals, are now part of what Russia is symbolically about. As opposed to these statist conceptions that had been expressed there before. Now, you see here, that was the space in, I don't know when I took that, sometime in the 1980s. It was an empty space you had to drive around, which was a gathering point for the great parades in Red Square. Now, it's got, in this very whimsy way, but actually rather successful, people use it, a scale, a human dimension. This is on the roof of that shopping centre. It is now a kind of plus which has some human scale and can be used as a space. Red Square, this is sometime I was there in May Day. This is the heads of thousands of people having a jolly time, a genuinely jolly time in Red Square, against, however, this ideological backdrop. And barring the tram, which is from 1905 or something, it's become again actually a rather dead place. There's a very posh shopping centre now in the old GUM, but it's not got any of that collective sense it had there. So we come to this 1999, the plan. Here you see again this general diagram. Now, this is a slightly different one from what you saw before, which I haven't got a duplicate, but here is, particularly around there, this industrial zone. Now, as the planners, because me and the chief architect and so on, set themselves this task to make it a globalny gorod, a global city, which of course is a technical term, not merely meaning just a rather big city in the world. It means something, if you read somebody like Saskia Sassen theorize this, something very specific about a center of intellectual innovation, particularly in the finance industries and so on. One of these driving centers of 21st century capitalism. Very much a city of the knowledge industries, which sets out to service those kind of populations in terms of their own life, comfort, meeting places, cultural support, and so on. At the same time, and she stresses this, each one of them, whether it's Tokyo, London, New York, whatever, Paris, is distinguished by being itself, by a nationalness, to prevent the kind of, they don't say it, but that sort of Hiltonization of not knowing quite where you are. At one level, they have a similarity, but differentness is part of that attraction to the class of high financiers and these innovative computer whizzes and so on, who are part of this global population. Now, they also recognize that this was, although they still call it Generalny Plan, a general plan is a totally different kind of document from a Soviet plan. That this is not, this is Kuzmin, he said, Soviet town planning was a monologue of the power structure. It decided what was going to happen and it bloody well did it, or did not do it. That's me, not him. The new town planning is, however, a dialogue with owners and investors. And this is why they put up a great big exhibition, actually, at the beginning when this was first launched. Under capitalism, one cannot dictate to the actors in urban activity. They have to be drawn into the process. And as Kuzmin rather charmingly puts it, they are like rules for traffic movement, these planning regulations, and they are identical for everyone. That's deep cynicism should attach to that in today's conditions in Moscow still. The general plan is not a plan for the parking of motor cars in specific places, metaphorically. It is a set of rules of behavior, civilized behavior in the city, which everyone must follow. Each will decide, each investor, each inhabitant who wants to build, for himself what he wants to do within these rules. Now, there's a number, of course, this thing is now, as we see, being driven in ways that have perhaps gone beyond a real sense of balance, the historic and the new. I just put on the core plan again to remind us here. Number of problems here. This is the new road structure. Now, one key problem is, I'll see in a minute the solution, that it is monocentric still. This centre and the roads are all been coming in. This city, everything comes into the centre. This is now to be made polycentric. What we see here is the new road structure, something called the third ring, Tretye Koltso, which is being put through that industrial area, which, as they say now, is strategically the great gift to the city. That industry is clapped out, it's totally uneconomic. It's largely 19th century factories and so on, but it is a dead area which lies between the housing which extends out and the centre. In this zone, they can build sub-centres, multifunctional sub-centres, unloading the centre of retail, of administration, also as we'll see of educational things and so on, which need to be boosted. And it becomes something all around, particularly around this area, which feeds out, it offers facilities for the outside and unloads the centre. And this new third ring, I'm rather a fan of, I've got some here. The mayor of Moscow has an awfully good website where, of course, lots of real decisions are not recorded, but there is some quite interesting progress statements, and they report how new bits of this are gradually being opened. This ring, he said, will be the motor of development for the middle zones of the city, which the city plan regards as having the most to gain from its proposals. And you see here the kind of crisis. This is part of the garden ring, the outer central ring, as it were, in the days when you could still walk across it. This is probably sometime in the Middle 80s. Stalin Tower, it's all rather charming, it's all rather calm. This actually now goes that way. This is one of the feeder streets into it. Slide I just happen to have. Complete chaos of motor cars. Not only is this also solid motor cars, but it's worse than anything of Livingston's, because none of the intersections actually work for traffic. So all this traffic is doing absurd loops. What they said in 1935 about this being just grand for lots of motor cars is, of course, completely swamped by today's level of car use. Now, this deals with housing here, with action areas of housing, and one of the main problems, of course, is this 5-story stuff that was put up under Khrushchev. And this is a lot of this sort of stock here, which will now be also demolished as part of this clearance of the sort of inner-outer zone. Awful lot of problems, of course, moving of people out, the whole negotiation and so on. This is a city for the knowledge industries, is another thing that actually I hadn't really realized quite before, how low, till you see the figures, is the percentage of student and postgraduate population in Moscow compared to any comparable city. And one of the things here, we see the multiple sub-centers in these blobs that are to be developed, retail, medical, everything in these outlying new centers. And one of the things that they will contain, according to the plan, is higher educational centers, institutes. A lot of popping up individually, privately. This I put on, this painting of Danicus, because it has, that's Moscow State University, one of Stalin's great towers on the hill. Somehow had the air, rather, of a cathedral of knowledge, sort of looking down on the city. This one's something else, which is absolutely inadequate to the kind of intellectual buzz that a place like this needs to have. Now, the last couple of images, I just sort of throw up the dilemma. This is commerce gone mad. A lot of it, of course, electronically, as it says here. I think I showed you this last time. This is the last election in December. For all the talk of democracy and all this talk about the regulations for planning are the same for everybody, of course it isn't working out in a somewhat mafia situation, quite like that. And the grip that some people are getting on the city, I think it seems to me, and I think everybody begins to feel, that this balance between conserving, restoring, there's a whole area in the middle here which is a conservation area, the balance is beginning to be tipped. And things that really ought to be kept, not least because they are the character of the city for these bankers who are supposed to flock here and so on, are going. This, I'm afraid, I was sure I had a better side of this picture till last night. I found only this, which is 1975, on a gloomy day. But this is the scandal of last summer, I find everybody talking about. It seemed quite beyond the point. This is a major department store of 1911. Department store for the military, right in the center of the city, just here at the beginning of what then becomes the Arbat, the new downtown. Very fine structure. I noticed my map guide of 1983 said last of the great pre-revolutionary department stores, smaller than the Army and Navy stores in Petersburg, but of similar and equally spacious plan. It's got a great atrium in the middle, grand staircase, fine galleries, very strong concrete frame, few modern elements around the door here. Dense small-scale penetration belies the bold structural frame inside. This was a building that could have become a very prestige department store. I must say I was gobsmacked when somebody came and said she lived just round the back. This was late August, and it was being demolished as she left home. The dust was filling their kitchen. And that's the sort of building which is at the mercy now of massive rise in land values, which is, of course, the consequence, the downside of the success of the rest of the strategy. So the whole issue about the fate of the historic buildings, this balance between what Lushkov says is the great we are your children Moscow kind of identity with the place. What it needs to keep as a place with that special flavor for the foreign investors who must come here and so on, versus the drive to modernize it is, I think, in a serious state of doubt and perhaps imbalance. Now, I think this is just for next week. This is, it's time to go clubbing. I think I showed you that last week, just to represent what the city is about to the hedonists who now have plenty of money. And next week we shall look at it, particularly at that scale, in terms of, as I said to you before, I think last week, what is happening to individual buildings at the mercy of this kind of, well, to some extent in celebration of course, this terrific individual affluence, and where that kind of money is being put. We'll also look at some of these other towns. And I hope that Bart, I don't know if he's here today, who has been traveling in some of these very abandoned places out in Siberia, will also show us some pictures of some of those sort of places that really are the downside of what's successful in Moscow. So that's next week. Thank you very much. Can I do the lights? I don't know. Just this funny thing that you found on your chairs, that's my little propaganda for an exhibition of mine, which is at the, not far from here, National Print Library. Brown, I have an invitation for you to go. I was just asking.